So wow, we're in week 10. You're nearly at the end. This week we're looking at a couple of things. The first part this week is agency in the classroom, and I'll explain a little bit further what that means as we go through. And here's roughly what we're going to cover. Why student agency means, why it's important, how we can support it. So as usual, I've put some embedded videos in here for you to follow up after. This one here is relatively brief and should explain it as well. It comes from New Zealand, and it's a teacher talking about what happens at their school. So have a look. It's not something that's just some talking person from the university telling you some ideas. It's actually some people who are really working in a school context and trying to develop a sense of student agency. So student agency is about control and the power to act. Who's got a voice and can say something? Can they have some choice and responsibility? And this is something that for you as a teacher you have to consider. It's not like you just have to always give students complete agency in everything, and it's also not the case that you never give them any agency. It's a balancing act, and as we've said all the way through this course, these are just ideas that you're going to have to consider and weigh up as you start your teaching career and you work in different places. We don't have a recipe about what works everywhere because it doesn't exist. But you do need to think about, what does the place of student agency have in the maths classroom? Where do you give them some choice? Where do you give them responsibility? How much responsibility? Responsibility for what? When do you let them speak and when do you let them listen? Where do they have some sort of control or power over what's going to happen? This will change also throughout your career as you become more experienced and more confident, but it's some ideas to think about. Certainly even as a new teacher, you want to give the students some sense of agency as they go through, because a sense of agency helps the students have some sort of ownership over the learning and a sense of purpose for themselves, which means they learn things better. So what are some of the outcomes of giving students agency? Well, first of all, it helps them develop the capacity to plan and implement and evaluate a goal or an idea. Once they leave school, or even outside of school, they're not going to have you there all the time doing these things for them. They need to, in a sense, be able to develop the idea for themselves. So maybe this means at the start you take more control, and as they move along you try and relinquish some of that control. Sometimes you might need to step back in to help them get them back on track. Sometimes you might start with a very open thing and get them to take control of their learning, and then you can see how they go, and then you might modify it as you go. But having a sense of agency plays an important role in the development of the students' or the learners' development of their identity in maths, their confidence in maths, and their own learning in maths. It helps them have a sense of ownership of what they've learned. And if you own it, if you've learned it for yourself, not just something that's been given to you by the teacher, then you're much more likely to remember it and to be able to use it. So there's lots of research around, and it says when we can give students a sense of agency and a sense of responsibility for their learning in maths, they're much more likely to be engaged. Now, again, there's another video for you to follow up, but what it looks like in the maths classroom, particularly in a differentiated classroom. One of the things I hope you've learned over the first 3 years of your degree, and particularly in the maths ones, is we need to have a differentiated classroom where we respond to and providing what's required for each of the students and their own learning needs. So something that in this case needs to be inclusive of all students. And again, historically in maths classes we've tended to plough straight down the middle and ignored the kids who are doing really well, and we've ignored the kids who are struggling. We just assume they're going to catch up. And this simply just isn't appropriate or acceptable for a professional teacher. We need to be inclusive of all. We need to sometimes help the students have some control. Now this doesn't mean all the time, but sometimes if you get them to pose their own problems, and then it probably needs some help from you to modify it and guide them towards how that might be a mathematically based problem in a maths classroom. But when kids pose their own problems, solve their own problems, they're much more likely to be engaged and interested in what the outcome is. Certainly one of the tutors in this program Kristen Zorn has done some work on this. Students also need to have some sort of power to act. So how are they going to solve the problem? Again, the tendency as teachers is we tell them the one way to do it as if that's the only way to do it. But we need to sometimes give them some power to choose how they're going to act, and then to see the outcome of that action, and then help them to understand and modify through giving them prompts and questions and encouragement, so they might then say, okay, maybe I should try a different way, or maybe this is working well, maybe I could modify it in this way. But trying to give them some sense of agency or ownership about how they're going to solve the problem. Giving them voice just means asking them, can you tell me how you're going to do something? Rather than you telling them how they're going to do something. Some choice, some responsibility. One of the things I think works well is when students have done something, an activity or a task or an assessment or something, ask them themselves to grade it themselves, mark it themselves, give themselves some feedback on it. You'll be surprised at how harsh they are on themselves normally. But challenge them to operate at the higher levels. Now, of course, it's easy to say this in this quick 5 minutes now. These are really difficult things to do. And this is why you as a teacher need to understand the craft and the profession of what you do. Because you've got to make decisions and choices as you go along. And these decisions and choices will be responsive to those learners in front of you and the material you're going to teach them. But it's important that as much as possible we give kids a sense of agency and ownership and choice and voice and power as they look to do the tasks. If they're always just doing what we tell them and regurgitating what we've told them, then in a sense they will be learning our stuff, but they won't learn much for themselves. And it's likely to be an impoverished maths education. So what do we need to do to develop student agency? Well, we know that there are, when students have a sense of agency, it addresses some things. First of all, teachers and students' perceptions of quality of learning are expected to be similar, but they are different. Their expectations are different when we don't give them a sense of agency. So it's about giving them a clear goal, but not necessarily telling them how to do it. We need to try and incorporate students' ways of thinking into lesson topics. So what that means is often there might be you will know as a teacher that sometimes there's just a really straightforward way of doing something and students go right around the world. So for example, there might be 20 bags of lollies with 5 lollies in each. You know that that's the easiest way to do that. The most elegant solution would be 20 times 5. But the student might want to go 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. That's their thinking, that's where they're at. If you just tell them the answer, then they're probably unlikely to see why that's a better solution or how it works. But if you let them do the whole long-winded way of doing it and then ask them questions, is there a better way of doing it? How else could we have done it? Then helping them to see for themselves that actually they're doing it by multiplication would have been an easier way. It helps them get a sense of ownership of what they've learned. It's important to try and integrate student interest into maths activities. So this isn't rocket science. If a kid's interested in something, they're much more likely to engage with it. So recently we had the Commonwealth Games or Olympic Games or other events, the bleach festivals on or whatever's happening around the place. Students are often interested in these things, and these can be great places to start the maths learning rather than starting with the maths itself. But trying to connect with their interests is important. Trying to help them develop their own mathematical identity, trying to help them do this through engaging with tasks that they enjoy and they're interested in. Having a sense of investment for themselves in what's going on rather than just doing what you've told them to do all the time. And often the use of group work and discussions really helps students develop the sense of ownership. Now all these things, again, this is easy to say. When you have group work and discussions, you might also have where one kid just dominates. So you've got to modify all those sorts of things and make sure you as a teacher are providing the professional care and structure around to facilitate deep learning. But as you can, try and help the students have a sense of ownership or agency about what's going on. Now, again, there's another video here, and this is from another teacher. This one's from America. Have a look and see what you think the teacher's role is here. Because sometimes we think when we say we give students more agency, it sounds like we're saying, well, a teacher, you just stand back and do nothing. And that's far from the truth. It's actually harder for you as a teacher because you've got to respond moment by moment as things are happening and unfolding in the classroom. So have a look at the video and see how she did it, and see if that helps you understand your role and how you might do this as you go forward. Here's a few things. As a teacher, when you're trying to develop student agency, you need to work with the students, obviously. See if you can see similarities and differences in ideas. Can you understand the mathematics they're trying to explain to you or show you, not just the mathematics that you want to see? Try and connect what you see and hear so you can then help them and modify them and encourage them towards other ways of seeing things. Sometimes they need to be told, but often a little prompt will help them to see it for themselves. You need to challenge them. So they might give you a more concrete solution, so you need to challenge them. Often they'll finish something, then it's that next little question you ask. The key here is trying to avoid telling kids the answer, which is the great challenge in mathematics lessons, because almost always when students do something or they're at a point, what do? We tell them the answer. And in the end, the answers are often not that important, but the processes of getting there are important. So to try and develop students' sense of ownership and agency in their doing, try and avoid telling them the answer and try and prompt them to think. And those prompts will depend on which student you're talking with. When you're working with students, try and ask them to justify their answer. Okay, you've done it this way. Why did you do it that way? Did it work well? I wonder if there's a different way of doing it. Have a look how someone else has done it. What do you think? Compare your ideas. What's the benefits and the disadvantages of each one? Trying to encourage them to move to more generalised and abstract views of the world. Mathematics itself is an abstraction. So try and help them to move to higher order ways of thinking, I guess we're trying to say. And then you're always trying to, in these sorts of situations, model a sense of intersubjective freedom, but also responsibility. So as students feel more open and encouraged to talk and share their ideas and wrestle with these ideas together, they also got to learn that they've got to have some restraint. So they need to talk and also let other people talk. They need to offer positive, encouraging feedback, not just ripping each other apart. They've got to listen to each other so they can respond thoughtfully. And these are things they can learn when they're given the opportunity and they have more agency in the classroom. And here's some things that the students need to do. They need to be encouraged, and again, you'll need to help them to learn these things and to develop these ideas because they're just not natural things they're going to come and do. Just by lumping them in a group and saying, you find a problem, it's not going to get there. Your role as a teacher is far more complex here than being very directed. You need to understand what misconceptions they might get and how you will respond to those misconceptions. You need to connect the ideas together, and that's often done by asking them questions. Oh, we did this today. Do you remember what we did yesterday? What do you see is similar and different from what we did? Those sorts of things. Again, this is really easy for me to sit here and say it. It's something you're going to wrestle with through your teaching career, but if you can do it well, your students are going to benefit greatly. So again, here's one last video for you to have a look at. Again, I encourage you to have a look. It goes through some of these things in practical ways that might be helpful. So the challenge for you after listening to this short video, wrestling with these ideas, again, I've thrown you some big ideas that are difficult to comprehend and understand and then just said go and do it. But you need to start thinking now, how would you see this unfolding in your classroom? How could you plan for it? And planning for it means not just the planning on the piece of paper, the lessons you've got, but also how you're going to plan yourself. How are you going to develop your own ways of thinking? How can you develop some sort of restraint so you don't just tell the kids the answer all the time? Now, the other thing to remember is in the last week of this course, we have a take-home exam, and the questions in that exam are going to come all from the lectures. So if you've watched the lectures and engaged with them, it should be fairly straightforward. But I'm just letting you know it's all coming from the lectures. And so some of the ideas we've talked about today could well appear as one of the questions. All right, see you soon.